So this is my presentation for my PhD proposal. The presentation will go for around about 20 minutes, and then there'll be some time for any discussion and questions afterwards. So as Asher mentioned, the title of the project is The Optimal Sheep Stocking Rates for Broadacre Farm Businesses in Western Australia. Next one. Yeah. The overall goal of the project is to provide some economically backed farm management advice to farmers, specifically focusing in on stocking rate and sheep management, with the aim to improve their overall long-term profitability. So we'll be looking at seasonal variation and tactics to handle that in order for farmers to minimise the loss in the poor years and maximise the gain in the good years. So the stocking rate problem's been around for a number of years for two main reasons. Firstly, stocking rate has a large impact on farm profitability. This has been found in a lot of research. Just about any farmer would agree. Stocking rates too low result in undergrazed pastures and foregone profit, whereas stocking rates too high results in overgrazed pastures, bare paddocks, erosion risks, and excessive supplementary feeding. And the second reason the stocking rate problem's been around for so long is its complexity. The stocking rate decision is dependent on a large number of farm factors, and it's linked to them all. For example, crop enterprise, labour availability, pasture production, weather and price conditions all impact the optimal stocking rate for a given year. So this makes it very complex to determine the optimal stocking rate, and it also means that the stocking rate is likely going to be different for each property. So early research into the stocking rate problem showed the importance of good decision management and provided a foundation for future work, suggesting that risk, feed availability, and sheep production are the three key factors that should be considered. So risk and seasonal variation directly impact the carrying capacity and optimal stocking rate for a given year. So that must be considered when determining the optimal stocking rate. Feed availability, again, is a key driver of stocking rate. So when optimising stocking rate, the nutrition available and the cost should be considered. And sheep production is influenced by the conditions throughout the year. And by that, I mean skinny, unfed sheep are going to produce less wool, less meat, lower reproduction. So the relationship between stocking rate, condition and production all need to be considered when determining the best stocking rate. So although the early research provided a good foundation, the lack of data and technology sort of resulted in findings that are not really applicable today, and also the farm systems have changed significantly in the last sort of 20, 30 years. Most recent research into stocking rate, directly or indirectly, has been conducted over east, and due to the variations in climate between Western Australia and over east, the findings can't easily be extrapolated to Western Australia. However, there has been some research into stocking rate in Western Australia, particularly by Trumpf in 2014. Trumpf used MIDAS to determine the optimal stocking rate in the low and medium rainfall zones of Western Australia. MIDAS captures the biology and the economics of the farm system. However, it doesn't capture seasonal variation or risk. So as mentioned by many people who have used MIDAS, and also Trumpf in his research mentioned that the lack of incorporation of risk tactics has resulted in inaccurate answers. So there is a lot of work for further development. Other research that has probably less predominant, other research that has been conducted into stocking rate in Western Australia is being done using simulation models. And simulation modelling is highly dependent on the skill of the user, as it doesn't provide an optimization technique. So that often means that although the findings are useful and provide a sort of insights into direction that should be headed, they can often miss the optimal solution. So the conclusion to this is that there is still a lot of work to be done in the stocking rate area to determine the best management for farmers in Western Australia. So I'll now talk a little about the proposed modelling approach that would be required to improve stocking rate findings into the future. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, the factors that are important to be captured in a model to represent stocking rate is firstly the whole farm system, including the economics, the biology, the seasonal variation, tactics that can be implemented by farmers as the season unfolds, and overall it must provide an optimization method to come up with the best solution, because a model so complex can be hard to determine the best solution at the end, and you can end up easily heading down the wrong track and ending in a local minima. So currently in Australia, there are three farm models, whole farm models. So firstly, MIDAS, secondly, MUDAS, and thirdly, OzFarm. MIDAS, as I mentioned before, is a whole farm linear program model with a joint emphasis on both the biology and the economics. However, it lacks representation of risk, seasonal variation, tactics that can be implemented. MUDAS is a discrete stochastic whole farm programming model that, again, it represents the biology and the economics, and it also represents seasonal variation, including weather and price. The limitation of MUDAS is that it was developed in the 90s, and due to the availability of technology and data at the time, it quickly fell into unuse and hasn't been updated since then. And given the changes in the farm system and the improvement in the findings about farm systems, how we can now represent them, MUDAS doesn't accurately represent the farm system any longer. OzFarm is a dynamic simulation model, so it does capture the biology of the farm over time, and does this in quite a lot of detail. However, it doesn't provide an optimization technique. So all three of these models do have some limitations, and that sort of leads to a few methods, few ways forward. Firstly, adding in seasonal variation into MIDAS. Secondly, updating MIDAS with new data and new findings and new format. Thirdly, adding an optimization technique to OzFarm. So MIDAS is developed in Excel, which is not that flexible and also even at the size MIDAS is currently, Excel is crashing a lot and running into a lot of problems. So adding in seasonal variation sort of makes the model tenfold bigger, which would result in a program, in a model that is likely going to crash a lot and be a lot of problem for the user. And that sort of shuts the door on any future development as well. And MUDAS is quite similar. It's also an Excel program. And updating it basically requires updating most of the models. So that would, again, that's a massive job that ends up with a model that sort of doesn't produce a lot for the future. Now, adding optimization techniques to simulation models has been done before, and there are a range of heuristic techniques that do this. It's basically what these techniques do is they try a range of different variable values and use some algorithm to slowly converge on an optimal solution. This was done. Panel and Dool in 2008 used a technique called compressed annealing to optimize a weed management simulation model called RIM. They concluded that it was successful for that. However, a model with much more detail would have resulted in much longer solution times. So it's likely that adding an optimization technique to AusFarm would result in sort of unreasonable solution times. So in this project, I propose a new model, similar, so it'll be a discrete stochastic programming model, similar to MUDAS. So it'll capture the biology, economics, variation, tactics, the farm system. The model will be developed in Python, and Python is a popular computing programming language that was chosen because it's open source, and well documented. So it's a lot easier for anyone to pick up and learn about. And it also is quite a lot more flexible than Excel, and sort of it will allow the model to sort of open the door for future development. So I'll now take a slight sidestep and talk a little about seasonal forecasting and how that's going to come into the project. So seasonal forecasting has been getting better and better over time as technology improves, and farmers are starting to wonder a little bit how they can, or if it's worthwhile using seasonal forecasting, and if so, how can they use it to improve their management decisions. Senthold 2012 linked up simulation modeling with seasonal forecasts such that in a year that was predicted to be above average, fertilizer application was increased, crop allocation was increased, and hence the stocking rate was increased. And in years in years that were predicted to be below average, fertilizer was reduced and stocking rates were run more conservatively in a way to sort of save on costs. The results showed that an extra $66 per hectare could be attained by using seasonal forecasting. However, this only assessed the impact of seasonal forecasting on a limited number of decision variables. So there's still a lot of work to improve findings on how to utilize seasonal forecasting to improve decision making, and also what is the value of improved seasonal forecasting. So in this project, I'll add the capacity of seasonal forecasting into the model, and this will allow the evaluation of seasonal forecasting on a lot more decision variables. So the overall aim of the project is to determine the optimal stocking rate for farm businesses in Western Australia. And in doing this, I'll answer a few different questions as well. So firstly, what is the optimal stocking rate? Secondly, how does seasonal and price variation affect choice of stocking rate? Thirdly, what tactics can be employed as the season unfolds, and how economically rational are these tactics for farmers? Fourthly, how would accurate price and weather forecasting impact farm management? Then how would current weather forecasting impact farm management, and how can that be included into optimization modeling? And lastly, how do different farm factors, including growing season, tactics used, flock structure, genetics, cost of supplementary feeding, crop area, meat and wool price, and total pasture growth affect the optimal stocking rate? So I'll now give a rundown on the proposed method. So firstly, I'll develop and document the model. To aid with the development process, I'll be using key concepts from MIDAS and MUDAS. MIDAS has been continuously updated up until the present day by researchers adding new techniques into it. So there's a lot of concepts in MIDAS that are still very applicable to the new model, particularly in areas such as the labour, supplementary feeding, stubble, pasture, machinery, and finance. And there's also some key concepts in MUDAS, particularly relating to seasonal variation. Although MUDAS is over 20 years old, the framework for incorporating price and weather for variation is still relevant to today. So I'll be taking some concepts from both of those models and using them in the newly developed model. Secondly, I'll be identifying all the tactics, management tactics that are relevant. So and ensuring that they're represented in the new model. So to do this, I'll be talking with getting together with farmers and farm consultants and discussing what tactics they believe are relevant or which ones would be interesting to evaluate. Thirdly, I'll be identifying the season types and the price states. So as we all know, every season is a little bit different, and representing every season and coming up with the data to support every season in a model or in a discrete stochastic model is unreasonable. So as Kingwell did with MUDAS, similar seasons will be grouped into a season type, and the season type will be represented into the model. And the similar thing is done with the price states. Fourthly, will be calibrating the model. The model is going to be calibrated to a case study farm in Williams. The case study farm's been collecting detailed farm data for over a decade. And so using the farm data and simulation modeling, I'll come up with the inputs, and I'll work very closely with the farm manager to ensure that the model is realistic and representative. Lastly, I'll use the new model to complete different analysis. So firstly, I'll evaluate the impact of seasonal and price variation. So basically to do this, I'll turn on and off the seasonal variation module. And this will be done, this is basically switching between a steady state model and a discrete stochastic model. And this will indicate the importance of including seasonal variation into farm models, and it'll also outline how farmers can manage their farm to handle the variation in seasons. Secondly, I'll evaluate the different management tactics, and this will indicate what tactics are best used to handle different years, and it'll also suggest to farmers what tactics might be worth it for them to go out and learn a bit more about to enhance their profit. Lastly, I'll complete a large sensitivity analysis. This will cover the various factors I mentioned above, such as pasture growth, tactics, flock structure, crop area, labour availability, and that will hopefully allow the results to be broadened to a wider number of farms and come up with some rules that will help farmers in different circumstances determine the optimal stocking rate for their farm. So the project is quite significant for a number of reasons. Firstly, with the increase in technology, there's a lot more farm data available, and computational power is a lot greater now. So it's quite feasible for complex whole farm models such as the one developed in this project. And this will open the door up to more accurate analysis, future development, which will be very handy for the agriculture industry as a whole. Secondly, the inclusion of forecasting into farm optimization modeling hasn't been done before. So doing this in the project will provide a base into how it can be done, and secondly, hopefully it will outline to farmers how they can use seasonal forecasting to improve their decision management and improve their profit. Thirdly, the findings from this project will will provide more accurate findings into sheep management, stocking rate decisions, which will hopefully lead to more profitability for farmers into the future. Thank you. Okay, so if anyone has any questions, we'll start with the audience that's in the room, and then we'll go to anyone on Zoom. You can just raise your hand or comment your question in the chat. All right, does anyone in the room have a question? Yep, we've got one question.
So, you're going to calibrate on one particular farm. How are you going to make sure that the results you're getting aren't conditioned to an unusual farm and then won't be generalizable across to the rest of the system?
Yeah, I guess that's a problem that could happen. Hopefully the farm is one I use in my honours project, and as sort of backed up in that literature, it is quite a representative farm. However, it could easily sort of, so I think it's quite a representative farm. So hopefully with the sensitivity analysis, the results will be able to be generalized. Although they're definitely not, the results are definitely not going to be as specific to other farms, but hopefully there will be enough guidance that there will be sort of some useful information for other farmers. Anyone else? Yep.
One of the problems with models like Midas is the requirement to have a steady state beginning and end of the accounting from year to year. Does your modelling framework that deals with seasonal variation avoid that issue in some way? Or how do you tackle that? So, for instance, with pasture, the impact of a poor year on the starting state and the end state is significant in terms of seed reserves and other things. Are you going to be able to deal with issues like that as part of your stochastic?
So you're almost sort of talking about year sequences in a way, yeah. So the standard one that'll be developed first will just assume that the present year is following a weighted average of the previous years, which if seasons are not if seasons they are correlated in the frequency. So meaning that if you have one bad year, you're more likely to have another bad year, which is quite common over East. That's not going to be counted for initially. However, the framework of the model will allow that season sequencing can be added with hopefully not too much more difficulty. So currently it'll just be the weighted average, but there's sort of room with this model developed in Python. It's a lot easier to add season sequence than it would have been in, for example, the Excel model. Yeah. And we've also developed a few other techniques, rotations and other things that have made it a lot easier to represent the following, like the sort of loop going from one year to the next.
Because the same issue comes up with a major driver of decisions, which is about weeds and crops, and so that issue becomes when you start to understand what's driving decision making, those issues become quite important. And RIM captures some of that. And I was interested in your comments about having a system that optimizes within RIM, but it doesn't seem like that's likely to be a useful tool for your complexity.
Yeah. So now it'll be, I think, for a whole farm model, trying to optimize a whole farm simulation model is a little bit, although simulation models do capture the biology of the farm very well, it's a bit at this moment in time, it's a bit hard to optimize a model like that in an efficient way. That's not, where you can run quite a few experiments and come up with a bit of solutions.
Yeah, so that's known in the literature as the curse of dimensionality. So Midas, which is a single model, if you have 10 season types with 5 price stakes, that's 50. If you want to run that across 2 seasons, that's 50 times 50. So
Yeah.
2,500 sequences you need to follow.
Yeah, so that's the main reason that the sequencing is not going to be included straight away, is due to the size and the cursor dimensionality, as Ross just mentioned. Yeah. All right. Well, I've got one question on here from Ben White. How can I just?
Hi, Michael. Thanks for the presentation. Can you hear me?
Yeah, just turning up the volume a little bit.
Okay.
All right. Yep. Go now.
So I suppose I've got a couple of comments. Why are you using Python? That's going to increase the length of your PhD by about 10 years. What's the issue around? I mean, I look at livestock farmers, and they're, it's a bit like your investment portfolio. The different stocking rates depends on levels of risk aversion. So are you going to include risk aversion in your model? And I suppose that, yeah, just those, I suppose those two comments. I mean, I'm surprised you're not going for a modern mathematical programming software like GAMS or possibly MATLAB that would save you a lot of time.
Right. Yeah, I did look into GAMS a little bit. I haven't looked into MATLAB, I must say, but I've looked into GAMS. But Python does have some good, or particular, the linear programming model, or the sort of package that's being used, is called Pyomo. Pyomo is quite reasonably new, but it's sort of mixed with Python. I believe it's quite a lot more flexible than GAMS, a lot easier for a new person to pick up. GAMS is not well documented as far as I can tell, although there is a little bit, but compared to Python, it's not that well documented, and it's a lot. So I'm thinking it's a lot easier to pick up Python. I've also had a bit of experience with it in the past, and yeah, Pyomo is a really good optimization package included in Python. And the risk aversion, I didn't mention much about that in my proposal. I didn't mention anything about that in the proposal, really. The model will have the capacity to include that. I haven't decided too much about what level of investigation into risk aversion I'll be doing. It's sort of been reasonably well documented before, and there's some research, particularly I think by Panel in 2012, who argued about the necessity of including it in farm models, and whether or not it's particularly useful.
Yeah, I mean, you can always assume risk neutrality. That's fine, but I think if you look at variations in stocking rates between farms, it will reflect farmers' attitudes towards risk. Mm-hmm. Yeah, GAMS comes with Cplex, which is probably the most powerful LP solver. It's viewed as the industrial strength LP solver for really big problems. Mm-hmm. And also it gives you the option, if you wish to switch to large nonlinear programming problems. Python is just going to take you much more time to develop, especially, I mean, if you're doing optimization, then basically you just have to define objective function plus your constraints. It's usually much quicker to do that in something like GAMS. So before making a decision, because that, you're lumbered with that decision for the next 3 years, then you might just want to explore a bit further, because developing big models in GAMS is actually quite quick, and it's got some database facilities as well. So I would just be a bit careful before you embark on using Python. I've run one project where I had to get some computer science students to do the Python bit because it was too hard for me. But you're, obviously much cleverer than I am, so leave that to you.
Right, yeah, I'll definitely keep those comments in consideration. And also, just as a side note, Pyomo does can be linked up with Cplex and basically every other solver as well. So there is some solver-wise, it's as good as GAMS, I believe. But I'll definitely have a bit more of a look into it before locking it in.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing about GAMS is it allows you, sorry, I'll take this offline, but the thing about GAMS is it allows you to represent large numbers of equations very succinctly.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an algebraic representation language.
Yeah, right. I'll definitely, we can chat with you later about that, and I'll look into it a bit more. Thank you. I've got a question from Roy. Do you want
to? Just had to unmute. Excellent, Mike. It's Roy Murray Pryor here, formerly at Muresk, and I did a bit of work on farmer decision making many years ago, and a little bit of programming of US dairy farmers in upstate New York. But I was very impressed with what you've done in the excellent overview of objectives, and but I was commenting and wondering about a couple of issues. One of the issues, and you've talked about it, is seasonal conditions. And my experience in WA of those sort of decisions is that using, well, first of all, it means that you make a lot of those decisions around about the break and before the break, So where you choose to start your year could be relevant to the whole decision. Whether you start it in the summer, because depending on the break of season, what happens pre-season, and then what happens during the season, you adjust your stocking rate to that. Now, when it comes down to optimal, as Ben says, some farmers don't bother doing a lot of that stuff and just have a lower stocking rate. But it's been my experience with sheep farmers, the higher your stocking rate, the more you have to be on the ball to adjust your stock numbers depending on the season. And that's also influenced by what your flock structure is. So if you're into breeding as opposed to fattening, so you didn't imply what you're going to do here, what's your flock structure? Are you trying to turn off prime lambs? Are you trying to turn off a combination of prime lambs and wool wethers? You're aiming for the boat market. So where do those factors fit in? I can see you might be able to do that, but I think they are considerations which also affects where you start your season, because you'll be doing it on a yearly basis, take it, when you talk about the seasons. The other comment I'd make in terms of risk aversion, Ben sort of commented on that. Obviously people are risk averse, but there are many other factors they consider in making decisions about risk. And it really depends on their strategic position, how well they set themselves up strategically to handle changes in conditions, and whether they're the sort of person who just sits and sets, or the sort of person who tries to optimize as far as possible, but then is ready to rapidly get out of the business. I'll shut up. Thanks. I'm very impressed with it. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So the model doesn't represent 1 year particularly. It's sort of, it will capture, there's no particular start of the season or end of the season as such. So it's sort of, the optimization technique considers the whole season for each season. So in that respect, there isn't a start and finish date that need to be considered. It sort of captures the whole system. And the flock structure comment. For starters, that is one of the sensitivities that I'll look into, is how different flock structures do affect your stocking rate, because as you mentioned, that can affect how easy you can, or the tactics you can implement, I guess. So, but for starters, the base flock structure I'll look at will be sort of based off of what I showed to be the most profitable in my honours project, which was sort of a first cross enterprise turning off finished lambs. So that'll be the base enterprise, and then I will examine the effects of different flock structures on the profitability and how that it might affect your tactics that you can implement as the year unfolds. And I'm not quite sure I can remember what you said about the risk. Sorry.
What I was saying, well, you can do it for risk, but the problem that people have different attitudes to risk, obviously. But if you're in a mixed farming situation, it depends how bigger proportion sheep are of your total operation as to whether you're going to worry too much about seasonal variations and how much effort you'll take into account. And you might just set and leave it. So what you're implying to me is you're setting and leaving. So you're not really looking at the optimal stocking rate as the season changes, because I used to use both, a bit like the cropping, you know, where you could, a simple model where you looked at how much pre-season rainfall you had and then how much was predicted for the rest of the season. And as you got the information, you adjust your stocking rate, but you're not really considering that. You're just saying an optimal stocking rate for a particular season and then optimizing across a series of seasons, I suppose. In which case, you know, there'll be the response curve or the profitability curve will be probably quite flat. So you'll have a lot of, you need to look at sensitivity. How sensitive is it? Are these optimal stocking rates to different decisions, different stocking rates?
Yeah. So that will be considered, sort of, I guess the model will determine how to change the stocking rate through the year. So, for example, buying or selling sheep if there's been no winter rain or no summer rain or whatever the tactic or whatever the indicator is, the model can then decide how it wants to alter its stocking rate. Be it if there's been a lot of summer rain and the break of the season's looking good, the model might opt to increase cropping area, which will result in a higher stocking rate. And as you said before about the farmers, so if a farmer's got, say, 90% of their farm in crop and 10% of their farm is devoted to livestock or pasture, then seasonal variation and their change in stocking rate isn't going to make a lot of difference to their overall profit. And that'll be captured by changing that proportion or the allocation of cropping in your farm system. So, and that would then result in the profit. So, for example, if I'm looking at a crop, one farm with 10% crop and one farm with 90% crop, and then looking at how stocking rate decisions impact the profitability, the farm with 10% pasture or sheep isn't going to have a lot of difference. So that would be I guess the finding would be that if you're not running a lot of sheep, then stocking rate decision is not a major factor for your profitability, and vice versa.
Also, when it comes down to what the optimal flock structure is, that really depends on what sort of country you've got. Some countries only suitable for breeding and maybe turning off weathers, you know, turning off boat weathers or something, and other country is suitable for fattening and turning off prime lambs. So that's really an issue. But anyway, you have to simplify. Excellent. Yeah,
I think that shows the importance of considering flock structure when determining your stocking rate. It's just that, as you said, it can be different for different scenarios and different conditions. So that'll definitely be considered in the project.
There is a question from Stephen. You can ask him.
Stephen, we have a question from you.
Yes. I don't know whether you said this or not. You might have, and I missed it. But looking at the impact of succeeding seasons and years, and just for background, I did do some work in the past with MUDUS, so I understand perfectly well the logic you are working with. But I remember that it was hard to include, although it's possible, sequences of bad seasons, like 2, 3, or 4 bad seasons in a row. Now, you probably know that bad sequences in a row have a much bigger impact than a bad season preceded by average years. And that's where another point is, that's where risk aversion can have a big impact. I remember with the MUDUS study, risk aversion had a really small impact. It didn't matter really what risk aversion was, because in the system that you are going to be looking at, if you're focusing on annual decisions and annual adjustments to seasons, the impact of risk aversion is going to be much less than when you're looking at decisions that involve long-term commitments and impacts over several years. So anyway, so the main question here is, are you intending to include sequences of bad years? And of course, sequence of good years, of course, also, but those are not such a worry for the farmers.
Yeah, so at least in my eyes currently, we're not, well, I don't think I'm going to get to the stage of including season sequence, because as you said, if we're looking at four poor seasons in a row, that you're looking at a model that's thousands of times bigger than already what's big. So that sort of, looking at that many sequences of poor years in an accurate way is probably beyond the current scope of the project. But the model will have the capacity to add that in. So that might be something that's looked at in the future. Looked at in the future. So that might be a limitation of the project, is the inclusion of season sequencing. Although potentially the first step is to actually do a bit of statistical analysis and work out what the likelihood of unrandom years are. So that is, because I guess if every year is a random probability weighted random probability to occur, then including seasonal variation doesn't really doesn't have any relevance, because a farmer doesn't know what the next years are going to be. However, if you know that one poor year means 3 more poor years, then I guess it is important to include. So the first step would be to actually look at whether or not that is statistically happening in Western Australia, and then move on from there. But currently we believe it's more important to represent different season types of the current year than it is to represent 1 or 2 season types with sequence, because they're the 2 options that would result in a similar sized model. If that makes sense.
Yes, it makes sense, but still, I would suggest you reconsider that you think about it carefully. The statistics, you'll see these things do happen, and if you talk with Ross Kingwell, I believe he's your supervisor,
yep,
he will confirm this. That really the sequence of seasons makes or breaks a farm. So that is really, I would say, the main issue. So you can't really sort of leave it aside, because you'll be leaving aside 50% of the problem. But the other thing, the way to look at it is not necessarily the future having a sequences of 3 bad seasons in the future. What I was referring to, you've already had 2 bad seasons in a row. that the next one could be good, bad, or or whatever. But the fact, the preceding, so what, it's a bit like a rotation, and cropping rotation, but now you're looking at rotations of seasons. If you had a previous average season, or whatever the previous seasons were, and you're making a decision now, no matter what the probabilities are of the future, they're going to be conditional. You're going to have conditional probabilities based on your past, because your system has memory. So you already had 2 or 3 bad years in a row. Obviously, that's going to create a very different decision environment than if you've had average seasons or good seasons. And that's not only agronomically, but perhaps even more important, financially. You will have been in debt already, and so on, right? Rather than having, and so I know, but there's been studies that have shown this empirically, that how you manage your really bad sequences and how you manage your good sequences really makes or breaks your farm business. So I think it's worth thinking about this a bit more. Otherwise, you might sort of neglect a key issue, a key part of your problem.
That's a very good point, Steve. It's Roy here. That's a very good point. I mean, and there are many issues. If you've had a couple of bad seasons, not just that, it's restocking becomes a problem.
Yes, I mean, the whole farm will go
the
under.
Cost of it and everything else.
It's not a matter of I mean, this is serious, right? It's not a matter of losing profit. It's a matter that you just go bankrupt and that's the end of your farm. You've got to sell it to someone else. And it has happened quite a bit. And we are into these, climate change means you're going to have much more of these pretty wild swings in your climate, one way or another. So it's, I think, and I'm not sure that has been done with that kind of logic in terms of, whole farm modeling, how to condition your expectations. So the future is whatever it is. You keep that model about expected seasons and so on, but now you make it conditional on your history, on your 3 last seasons, put it that way. Now you could perhaps, and that requires a bit of thinking. It's maybe not completely an optimization. It could be partly simulation exercise as well, because you could have different scenarios where you run your model with conditional scenarios of your past history. So that doesn't necessarily make it unfeasible or harder. It's just a different way to think about it. I think it is worth looking into.
Yeah, sounds worthwhile. I've got a couple of comments, I think, from the audience in here. So,
well, just on that, I agree with Steve, but there's some really interesting information coming out of the Plant Farm survey, which looked for factors in trying to identify who were in the top 25% of farmers. And the most common factor was the ability the willingness of farmers to make tactical adjustments to their seasonal scenarios. So that's imposing a tactical decision on top of their sound strategy. And when they looked at those farmers through time, it didn't matter what the season type was, they were making those best decisions. But they made more money in the good years and they lost less in the poor years. So I think the point is that getting that one season thing right is probably more important than the longer term. I mean, it's picked up in the longer term, but getting it right and adjusting tactically is, in any single season, is probably the most important thing for long-term profitability. And so while I agree and I was trying to get at that in some ways in asking the earlier question in a more biological framework about what happens over years to the status and potential of pastures as affected by a series of bad years. I think that that's probably the second order issue rather than the primary one, which is about getting the settings right.
Yep.
So for me, I think there's 2 ways. I like Steve's idea where you have different starting conditions. So you say, and you can determine those starting conditions by discussion with farmers and farm management consultants. That is, if there were 2 poor years, what would farmers typically do? And then that constitutes the starting conditions for the model, which would expose the need to consider risk aversion if you've had very bleak sequences of years preceding your current decision year. The other way to show the importance of different seasons is just to alter the probability distribution of seasons, which again is one way of either capturing climate change or just reflecting the relative importance of farm decision making of poor seasons. So you could say, well, run the model with a much higher frequency of poor seasons. What does that do for flock structure for stocking rate? And contrast that finding against one where you have more typical frequencies of seasons.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's definitely something to sound like it is feasible to do it slightly different to how I was thinking. So they'll definitely try and include that in the project somehow. Thanks for that comment, Steve. I think that might be. Does anyone else have any questions? Looks like there's no hands up, so I might end that now. Thank you everyone for coming. That's all.
Thank you very much, Michael, for very interesting and very thoughtful presentation. So next week also we are going to have a proposed presentation by Christine Profit on plastic recycling. Thank you very much.